I'm really jealous of Cristina because she's been in the New Yorker, and that's something I can't figure out how to do. So the thought of me introducing a New Yorker writer is absurd, but we're going to chat, right?
You've written 13 books.
But the New Yorker, man, come on. You know, we lived in this barrio in San Diego, Logan, Barrio Logan, and my mother was a Manhattanite, a New Yorker, and so she would, you know, it was kind of a ghetto spot. It was a tough spot, and she would hang on to the New Yorker as her little bit of culture. We'd come every week. I think we were the only people in the neighborhood that got the New Yorker and Yankee magazine. Anybody read that little one from me? I thought, this is cool. There's some place in the world where they have maple syrup and stuff, you know. And, but so the New Yorker had this huge effect on me. You know, I think I have seen it as kind of a, you know, a temple that I can't approach.
I mean, I would think that it seems like they should be knocking down your door for.
Well, that's what I say. But, and you know, by the way, we're now represented by the same agent. I'm so excited about that. We're stablemates now, which is really cool. So there's so many things we want to chat about. We also have a question and answer period, and we both feel that it's really interesting to hear what you'd like to hear about, so we'll chat some, but we're really interested in responding to you about what you might want to know or hear about. We were talking in the green room about our experience moving here to Chicago, coming from worlds that were so different, and my one joy about having he introduces Cristina to the audience is that I don't have to do much. I can just ask her a question and sit here going, while you talk. But what I was curious about, because I think you and I approach similar issues in some way, you know, we both have the dual experience. We both have profound roots in a place that seems on the surface of it kind of magical and exotic, and it's easy to mythologize it. And then another foot firmly in modern America. And I was just really curious how that plays out for you in your thought and your work, you know, and your daily. You're in Hinsdale, I'm in Naperville. So we were realizing that we didn't put ourselves in the heart of the city. We went out there. I know, somebody just tisked us. Hey, Naperville's cool, man. It's 30 miles closer to the Rockies where I belong. But,
well, you have a great independent bookstore in Naperville. Yeah, we have
Anderson's bookstore, so you know we're gonna pull the power out there to the burbs, baby. You know, but what is your experience as a writer thinking about this cultural stuff?
Well, yeah, I mean, for me, it took a long time before I felt like I was able to write about Panama. I mean, well, I guess when I went to Northwestern and did my undergrad there. First thought I wanted to be a poet, and then just turned out I was just terrible at poetry. Yeah, but you actually write poetry now.
No, I'm very good.
I was horrible. So I took some fiction classes, and it turned out that, you know, that just felt like the right thing to do. But it took forever before I figured out that I wanted, or that I had the authority to write about Panama. Because I was born here. I was born in Delaware.
Oh, you were?
Yeah. Whenever I tell people that, they always say, you know, I've never met anybody from Delaware.
You're it.
Yeah. But I was writing, when I got to graduate school, I went to the Iowa Writers Workshop, and when I got there, I was writing stories that were set in the United States. Because that's just what I had been doing the whole time. I felt like, you know, I was born here, I grew up here, I felt more American than anything. Despite the fact that my father's from Panama, and we would go every summer since I was about 8 months old, we would go to Panama and spend almost the whole summer there. And I sort of felt like an honorary resident in a way, because we would go and we wouldn't do touristy things because all of my dad's family was still there. So we would go and stay with my grandparents, and we were like, you know, picking up prescriptions for my grandmother at the pharmacy, and we were never eating at restaurants, and we were never staying at hotels. We were just doing all the sort of day-to-day things that any Panamanian would do. So I had a real experience of what it was like to live in Panama, despite the fact that I wasn't born there, you know, and hadn't ever actually lived there. But because of those two things, I thought, maybe I'm not allowed to write about Panama. Maybe it's not really mine to say anything about. So it took forever. It took, actually what had happened was I read a little bit in an anthology. There was an excerpt from The House on Mango Street. And I read that and I thought, maybe I could write, like maybe I want to write about Panama. So I started doing it, but just on my own. I would not show anybody those stories. I was still only workshopping the stories that were set in the United States. And those stories were just, I mean, they were all falling flat for some reason, which I still haven't totally been able to identify why. But once I started writing the stories about Panama, everything sort of came alive. And then I realized, you know, maybe, I guess I sort of took the leap of faith to think, I'm a fiction writer, I can write what I want, even if I don't technically have the authority, whatever that means. I mean, you know, you have to believe maybe at some point that because you're a fiction writer and you're relying on your imagination, that you have the authority to write about anything in the world, which is still sort of a question I think about a lot. So finally, you know, I started showing people those stories, and the response was just totally different from the stories I had been writing up until that point. And then I just sort of went off from there. But, you know, I still think about it a lot.
I love that about feeling you don't have the permission to write. I felt that way about Chicago. I feel like I hadn't earned Chicago yet, and I started to understand that for my process, the place I was at before has to be internalized long enough to become part of the mythology within me, and it starts coming out. So I came here from Louisiana. I was writer in residence in Lafayette, Louisiana. Ernest Gaines was there, and he had just gotten his MacArthur and wisely taken his bundle of money and gone to Paris. And I had friends in the writing program, and they asked me, would you like to be junior Ernest Gaines? I said, oh, heck yeah, are you kidding? Yes. And we loved it there and spent a few years there. But I realized that only now is Louisiana starting to appear. And I think it gets internalized, and you process it, and it starts to feel more yours. And I was confessing to Cristina, when we got here in '99, and we lived over on the edge of Oak Park at first, off Harlem. And I think in my mind, I had one foot out the door the whole time. I thought, well, I'm going to come to Chicago, and we'll do a year or two here, and then head off. And it didn't turn out that way. And I think now that I've learned to settle in to Chicago land, so we can include Naperville, I found it so warm and welcoming that it's becoming, in my mind, kind of home.
So do you feel like you've been here long enough now that you can start to write about it, that you've started to process it and it's sort of marinated in your brain?
Yeah, I think so. And it's helped me. You heard about Queen of America, the sequel to Hummingbird's Daughter. In some ways, it really helped me to trace, it's my aunt, the Saint of Cabora, Teresita, to have traced her journeys, because the first book is all about Mexico, but the second book's about the United States. She was sent here in exile. And, you know, she lived in St. Louis. She was in St. Louis as they were building the World's Fair, you know, and there's no proof she came through Chicago, but she went to New York City from St. Louis. So I'm just assuming the train, you know, passed through there. So in some ways it was kind of a soul journey following her here. I'm working on this book about Red Cross women in World War II. And every time I sit down to do a little research, I laugh because I know my fans are going to be like, where's the Mexicans, man? I don't see any Mexicans. But, you know.
Do you feel that pressure? That's
sometimes.
One of the things I wanted to hear you talk about.
Pressure?
Or maybe the idea of being, do you feel pigeonholed, or you feel like there's this expectation that there's a certain thing you're supposed to be writing about at this point and that you can't stray from that?
Well, Cristina, do you? You know, I think there's a certain element of that. I mean, you know, you've been to enough book festivals that you know that you often end up on a very sincere, you know, panel with 15 Latinos, and there are 5 academics and a couple of people who came over from the barrio to watch it. And, you know, you chafe at that a little bit because there's so much you want to say. But on the other hand, I think the stuff follows you, and you have to, you know, there's a lot, as you well know, there's a lot of pressure applied to people with our kinds of names. And, you know, I just got home last night from Tucson. And, you know, Tucson grabs onto us as authors because of the book bannings. And, you know, you go there, and there's one thing to be here and have a talk as a literary figure. It's another thing to go there and have people grab onto you as though you're Emiliano Zapata. You're the only one standing out there stopping the forces that are attacking us. They brought me a 19-year-old girl, Maria Teresa, a little slender, shy woman, who was arrested and put in jail for protesting the banning of poetry. Are you kidding me? You can go to jail in the United States for protecting poetry. So, you know, that never leaves you.
Yeah.
And, you know, when you're out in the public, you can say anything. You know, you can't help but be political because of your name, right?
But I feel like
people add it to you.
Yeah, they do. But I'm trying to figure out a way to get out of it.
Well, it's about us. I don't like them politics. I like us politics.
Right.
So I'm trying to talk about humanity. And I think it's taken me a while to do. I think what you and I are both trying to do is say, look, you know, I'm a member of your family, and we can talk to each other. We need to talk. We've forgotten how to talk to each other.
Right.
And I think I'm a little different than you in that you know, born in Tijuana, I came to the United States at about 4.5, 5 years old, spoke Spanish before I spoke English, did not believe that people like me published books. I thought if you were going to be a published author, you had to be Mark Twain, but you weren't going to be Luis Urrea. That didn't happen. And it was my great shock to start discovering people like Garcia Marquez and Borges and Rudolfo Anaya, Bless Me Ultima. And when I realized that our stories were great stories and that there were people doing it, you couldn't stop me then.
Yeah.
And, but I've realized that my thing was I have been, I think, very assiduously paying respect to my father's culture. And now I've gotten the freedom and the independence and probably the sense of security to acknowledge my mother's culture as well. And that's great. It's a wonderful feeling. So yeah, it's an integration thing, I think.
Yeah, I mean, that rings true to me, the feeling of, I mean, I'm essentially writing my father's culture. I mean, it was mine in some, you know, abstract, adapted way, but I mean, it's his. It's where he grew up. It's, you know, he's the reason for my connection to that place. But also, when you talked before about this, making the journey into the United States with your characters, that's interesting to me, because I just finished a new novel where, I mean, my 2 previous books have both been set in Panama, and now this new one is Panamanian characters, but in the United States. They're actually in Delaware. It's the great Delaware novel that everyone's been waiting for, right? Yeah. But that was a big sort of transition for me, as, you know, artistically, to move from setting my head in that space of Panama and moving to the United States, where, you know, as I said, 10 years before, I had been writing stories that just weren't working. But so to trust that I was able to find my way back to this place, to, you know, the place that was really mine instead of my dad's, which was Delaware, and be able to write that was sort of an act of faith for me. But, you know, I'm excited about how it turned out.
It's so exciting. It's so exciting because you know, you're always in an exploration. It's like going down the Amazon. You never know what's around the next bend. You never know what you're going to discover about yourself, you know, and about the place. And I always think of, I tell my students here at UIC this a lot, but I always think of Edward Hoagland, the great essayist, and he says, you know, I'm essentially a rhapsodist. He's in love with the world. And when you look at his story, it touches me because he had a terrible stammer when he was a little child, and he couldn't speak. He couldn't get a sentence out. But words on the page could sing regardless of stuttering and stammering. And I think that's a really remarkable thing when you think about it. And I think it's, you know, to me, almost everything is metaphoric. So I think about his affliction, which I think is all of our affliction. We're all silenced by something sometimes. And if you have a bilingual issue, it's even more profound. I write about the border. I'm always telling people this, because the border to me is a physical representation. It's an actual metaphor for what separates us all the time. And, you know, every audience I speak to has border fences running through it, and people just don't realize it. And I think part of our job as writers is we're pushing little notes through the fence to the person over on the other side, you know. And I experience it in my undergrad classes here, for example. You know, these wonderful young women who come, Middle Eastern women, wear the hijab. And they're brilliant. But often the first day of class, there's a little zone around them where people haven't sat next to them. I noticed this. And I've thought about how do I, you know, you can't come in and say, we're all human here. You can't go on a,
Let's
you know.
hold hands.
Yeah, right, let's hold hands and sing Kumbaya. But there are ways, and I've learned the way is through story, the way is through conversation. And so I'd get to class early in those classes, and I would start chatting with these young women. And when people hear about, what's your favorite TV show? You know, hey, what do you see the class close in and people unite. So I think story is very powerful that way to reach through those fences.
Yeah.
So how do you see yourself as a representative?
No. And I really that's like a very uncomfortable idea to me. I mean, I wrote a story years and years ago. It was published in the Virginia Quarterly Review, and it was one of my first published stories, so it's kind of a big deal. My mom translated it into Spanish and sent it to my whole family in Panama, and, you know, everyone was excited. And then I remember I went to Panama, you know, a few months later, and I was in the car with my dad's, one of his old friends from high school. We were going out to dinner or something while I was there. And she got really mad at me in the car about the characters in the story. And one of the characters was a drug dealer, and the other character was just this girl who was basically, she was pregnant and didn't want to have the kid and was trying to figure out a way almost to like induce a miscarriage. They weren't like, you know, the most likable characters. But to me, they were really human in the story, and they, you know, they had flaws, but they had a lot of good points too. But she got really angry with me about what I was saying about Panama at large, and that she felt really like I had written a story that anyone in the United States who would read it would get the wrong idea about what a Panamanian person was like, what Panama was as a culture. I mean, even there were little throwaway things in there like about how most people don't have dryers. You know, you wash your clothes in the washing machine and then you hang them out to dry, but no one has a dryer because, you know, there's the sun. So but she was like telling me, you know, the names of all her friends who actually have dryers. So how I was wrong, people have dryers, you know, she was picking it apart, you know, like sentence by sentence, really angry about it. And that was the first time I had been confronted with that idea that people felt or were going to feel like I was representing them. And there's a great responsibility that comes along with that. But I also really deeply feel like, and what I told her at the time is, these were these characters in this story, and I was not trying to say something larger about Panama. I mean, I think you have to be aware of it as an author, that it's going to be interpreted that way.
People will run with it.
Yeah.
You know.
But it's so hard for me. You know, I feel like in an ideal world, which it isn't, but that in an ideal world, you know, people would understand that it was specific to that story, to those characters, that you are not a representative, and I don't want to be. I mean, I know a very, very small slice of Panama, you know.
It's really tough. I agree with you 100%. I said to an interviewer this summer, I was on this NPR show, and they asked me some immigration question, and I said something, and in the break, the host said, "We're going to get emails about that." And I said, "Really?" And he said, "Don't worry, we're NPR, we'll shield you." And I said, so people are going to write hate mail? And he said, "Oh, yeah." And I said, "You know what really drives me crazy?" I said, "If you had asked me what's your favorite fast food, and I'd said, well, I like fish tacos more than hot dogs, I would get email telling me I'm anti-American and a traitor." So there's some ways in which you're stuck representing, even when you just want to walk around in your shorts and watch some TV. You know, that's what I mean by you can't help but be political with your name. And I've gotten that feedback in Mexico, too, about, you know, you may know this about me or not, but I really got rolling working with missionaries in Tijuana, the Tijuana garbage dump, attending to the lowest possible of the low. And, you know, I've had people say to me in Mexico, "Why would you represent us with those filthy people?" I always tell them, "What are you talking about? Those are the best people in the world. They're just in a bad situation, man." And it's not about Mexico. It's about the people that I'm dealing with. But that's an issue that's a tough one. And expectations are really hard to massage. I feel this great responsibility. Yeah. And a great love, a profound sense of love for both cultures. But I think one of my little oddities of my mind is I think everybody was brought up part Latino and part Anglo. I think you all go home and speak Spanish. And, right? And you heat up a tortilla and put some peanut butter. I get some la peanut butter, put it on the tortilla. And it's a shocker to me to realize, no, that's not the case. It's something else. Right? You don't, it's not Spanish. Or people, you know, don't throw on their Ruben Blades CDs. So that's really interesting. I want to watch the time. Does anybody, do you have any questions or things you want to talk about? We can talk the whole time, but I'm just so eager to hear what you might want to hear about. Yes.
You sound so darling, so refreshing and nice. Why do you feel the need to apologize for stuff that you do when you write? You write it, you wrote what you wrote, and that's it. Why do you even have to pollute your brain with anything?
Who's apologizing?
Well, that's what I told her.
When did I apologize?
But that is what I told this woman. I said, this is the story. This is what I wrote. These are these characters. You know, yeah.
It's tough though, right? You know,
It's not only tough. I mean, I think it's tough from the cultural standpoint, but I feel this in every aspect of fiction, sort of. I mean, right now, this new novel that I wrote is set in Delaware, as I said, and some sort of terrible things happen in the novel, which is partly based on a true story that happened in Delaware. And I'm already sort of anticipating that, you know, people in Delaware are going to be like, hey, nobody writes about us. Why? The one person who wanted to write about us would write about this awful thing that happened in Delaware. Like, you know?
But that's true everywhere. I think, you know, being a writer is a really odd position anyway, because you make something, and then by the nature of having published it, it belongs to whoever read it. And then they start in. You know, you get your Amazon reviews or your newspaper reviews, or everybody has an opinion, and sometimes they're quite vivid. And you know, you just have to you have to roll with those things, you know, and sometimes the responses are pretty severe. I had 5 books banned in Arizona. I became king of the band. I know, I feel pretty badass about it, but.
Right, there's a way that you can take it as a compliment too when there's that sort of
people have
a strong opinion
response.
One way or the other. You know, maybe you're onto something. You're doing something right.
But you know, much of our job is being looked at by strangers. My career, I mean, you know, we're at UIC and my bosses are here, but much of my career is going to rooms full of hundreds of strangers, and you don't know what's going to happen or what they're going to say. I remember one time I was in Pasadena. They had picked Hummingbird's daughter for their all-city read, right? It was awesome. beautiful event, 900 people. I thought, I have arrived. I'm Bruce Springsteen today, you know? And my daughter was with us, so we were really happy. And they gave us a dinner, and this one woman waited till the very end of the supper. And she kept looking at me and smiling, and I thought, oh, it's a super fan. And at the end of the dinner, she came up to me and she said, I just want you to know that if you had used language like is in this book in my household, we would have hit you in the mouth for it. And I said, well, it wasn't written about your family, it's written about somebody else's family. And she said, well, your work doesn't please me. I said, well, who said I signed a contract to please you? But I thought, you know, you want to make friends, and sometimes you just can't. Mm-hmm. And then sometimes they attribute even greater things than you ever imagined. You just wanted to spin a yarn, and they, you know, they act like. So it's a very confusing thing. But I think the cultural thing for me is really powerful, and I don't know why. I don't know why if somebody Latino comes to me with an issue, mm-hmm. I just like, oh my God, you know, I want to make sure I got this straight.
And then on the flip side, I mean, I've been very fortunate to do events where, I don't know why, but it seems like every event I do almost, there's a Panamanian who shows up. And they come up to me, and when they're really gratified and they say, oh, you got it right, or, oh, you know, I remember that street, and I'm so glad you included that in your story. You know, little things like that. That is like the biggest compliment to me when it's somebody from Panama who's telling me that I got it right. That I did justice somehow to their culture.
Sometimes just naming the neighborhood and doing it right. I've learned that there are little things, certainly with the Mexican culture, that aren't seen as beautiful, and they are. And sometimes you have to remind people that they are. I talk to a lot of kids, and you go to Colorado, Arizona, Texas, and there are a lot of these little Mexican and Mexican-American kids who are flinching. They're ashamed, and all they hear is illegal, 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 which equals brown is bad, and they think they're bad, whether they're documented or not. They're just children. And so, you know, I've realized that just doing this to them, making a tortilla, they cry. Say, you know, this is sacred, right? Say, you know the history of this? You know that Aztecs made these, Tlaxcaltines? You know, and you start telling about the history. I say, you know, those 10 million, 100 million women doing this every day, every time they did that, they said a prayer for you. Every time they did that, they applauded you for your future. These little kids freak out because when you first start doing it, they start to laugh. Oh, God, you're making a tortilla, man, you know? But when you start talking about these beautiful rituals that we don't always see or understand as beautiful, I think that's really powerful, and it's alchemy in a way. You know, making gold for them, and you do it for yourself, and you know, I just feel profound sense of love and connection thanks to the work, right? And I'm so grateful that we had the gift of words. Where did your gift of words come from?
My parents hate for me to tell anybody this, but
come on now, we're among
no,
friends.
but we didn't have books in my house when I was growing up. And you know, and so now my mom, if she were here, would run up from the back. I read to you when I was, you know. But my grandfather, my Panamanian grandfather, was a journalist for 40 years. Had a radio show in Panama. Was the mayor of Panama City for a little while. I mean, but really was sort of this amazing guy. And he wrote a book of short stories. And, you know, I didn't know any of this for a long time, but that was all the case. And then, I mean, when I was growing up, though, you know, I was definitely the kid who, you know, the scholastic book thing would come at school, and I would run home and circle all the books that I wanted. It was like the best day of my life every time that thing would come. So I just loved it from the beginning, even though it was not something that was in, you know, part of the atmosphere of our house. But I didn't know. I was also sort of that overachieving perfectionist kid who was just, you know, getting as good a grades in math as I was in English. So I didn't know until I got to college, really, that it was something I wanted to do over other things that I wanted to.
Wow.
It took a long time for me to figure it out. I mean, looking back, maybe you could trace it. You know, I was writing little poems and stuff like that, and having fantasies of sending them to Highlights magazine, and you know,
Cricket.
that kind of, yeah,
Cricket magazine.
that kind of stuff. But you know, it wasn't something I identified until much later.
So did you have a really strong kind of, you know, storytelling in the family? You know, my family were all these crazy, fabulous, and full-on liars, you know, and they were always telling these outrageous tales, and I just realized that it was so fascinating. I was just absorbing,
Yeah.
you know, at their knee.
I don't think we did. I think we did, my grandfather, again, but I didn't understand any of it. Because when we would go to Panama, he would be speaking in Spanish, and I didn't know Spanish. So I would go, and my mom would translate, you know, stand in between the two of us and tell us some things. But I would sit in a room with the whole family around, and my grandfather was regaling everybody with his tales, and people were, you know, falling off their chairs, laughing and snapping their fingers, and, you know, it was this whole sort of joyous atmosphere, and I had no idea what was going on. I would just be sitting there, sort of taking in the feeling, the mood, but not knowing what the story was.
That's really cool. Yeah, I was different. But you know, the joy, I think, is central to all of
Yeah, that was
this.
part of it, for sure.
And it's one of my rules in the workshops that you know, joy, I have this little catchphrase that a friend of ours stole and wrote in an essay. I was like, I'm so mad at you for that. But, you know, joy is a virus, and it infects people with humanity. And it's really hard to disparage somebody or look down on them or consider them less than human if you've looked in each other's eyes and laughed over something together, as powerful and cathartic as weeping together over something. And so it's important in my work, but you know, given this multicultural exposure that I accidentally live in, I mean, if I'd had my choice, definitely it would have been Jimmy Stewart's grandson born in Beverly Hills. It didn't happen that way. I was born in Tijuana, lived on a dirt street, dying of tuberculosis. That wasn't my choice, it just happened. But you know, the rich mix is so cool. My wife and I, my wife happens to be, you know, blessed to be the only American member of the Urrea family. And we will go home to San Diego and they feed us a supper, then they all watch her. Like, mira, 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 está comiendo, mira. You know, poor Cindy. And we had this Thanksgiving down there, and they thought, you know, she's here. We're going to do it American style, right? And we're at my brother's house, and it's this crazy house, all painted in psychotic primary colors with these big purple, you know, positive thoughts. Todo está bien, painted across the wall, you know. And we sit down to the meal, and they put the little plate with a piece of turkey and a little stuffing and all this, and we're like, oh, great. And the hostess comes out with a pitcher, and she leans over and pours this white fluid over the whole plate, and then fills each plate with fluid. And we were looking at it, and Cindy says to her, Armida, is that gravy? And Armida says, son los mashed potatoes. You know, there's a whole story in the picture of los mashed potatoes, man. So, you know, it's really fun to be able to enjoy that sort of universal happiness together. I think that's really powerful, magical.
Well, and I definitely got the sense of how important the story was when I went there.
Right? Yeah.
You know, how it would just sort of light everybody up. I mean, you know, in my family, we would always talk about, my dad is a totally different person the second we land in Panama.
My dad, too.
So, I mean, he's just like happy all of a sudden in a way that, you know, he's not here. I mean, he's happy, fine here, but he just comes alive.
That is so absolutely gospel true. My dad was very charming, joyous guy, but lived with a nugget of kind of rage and pain here because he came here from Mexico and he never was able to realize himself here. He'd reached certain heights in Mexico, and here he was a custodian. And here he worked for my high school quarterback. And this kid was 17 years old and was ordering him around, and it's just, you'd see my father turn purple with rage. And then we'd go to Mexico. We'd get to Sinaloa.
Just
He
relax.
was the great man.
Yeah.
He was the great man. And they all remembered his boyhood. And he was then in his world. And I was the hippie freak, you know, that he was trying to control all the time. Be more Mexican. He thought I was too American. Eres Mexicano. I said, yeah, Dad.
Yeah.
It was interesting, but it's
I mean, even, well, for my dad now, I mean, he's gone on to, I mean, he's senior vice president of the company where he is. I mean, he's gone on to great success. He got his master's degree in chemical engineering from Northwestern, and he's done a lot of things, but he still, to this day, when he has to do a presentation, he like freaks out, like behind the scenes because of his English, his accent, just not being sure, like just not sure of himself still after, you know, 40 years here.
Yeah, that's kind of hard to shake, though. You know, my dad, I've told this story before, but my dad was always struggling to control his accent.
Yeah.
And I had the gift of growing up with an American English speaker and a Spanish speaker,
Right.
so my accent went away because it's more like Mom.
Right. Yeah, my mom is from New Jersey, so.
Maybe they knew each other.
But I didn't know my dad had an accent until I was in college.
Oh, all of a sudden you're like,
No,
wait a minute. What?
I didn't even realize it still. He came to visit me at school, and my friend, when he left, my friend said something about, like, oh, I love your dad's accent. And I was like, what are you talking about? My dad doesn't have an accent.
Yeah.
Because that was just, you know, I'd heard that voice from the time, you know, I came out of the womb. I didn't know that didn't sound any different to me than anything
That's
else.
funny.
I had no idea.
Oh, I was accent crazy, man. My dad, the other day, our daughter, you know, she goes to DePaul, and I hear her say, oh my God. I said, Chicago girl. My dad, in the last year of his life, came up to me, he said, Luis, when I speak English, do you notice the slightest Mexican accent? I said, no way, Dad. You got a beat, man. I told him, you know, you sound English to me, in fact. Anyway, yeah, it's all grist for the mill. Yeah, somebody.
You learned from Ernest Gaines?
What I learned from Ernest Gaines. Oh my God. Have you seen Il Postino? You know that movie about Neruda and the mailman? I felt like the mailman. The great man. We lived, you know, with him in his little neighborhood next to ULL, which they call Ooh La La. He is a truly great man. Great, great man. And I think when Oprah picked A Lesson Before Dying, it kind of startled him. All of a sudden, he was a millionaire, you know. I learned a lot of things about him. I learned about his integrity and dignity in a world that kind of looked down on him. Graduate students called him Ernie, and I would not allow them. I said, he's Mr. Gaines to you. He's not Ernie to you, ever. But I also learned about, you know, that was a man who was and is an artist with love and a grip on his people and his history. And yeah, he taught, but he was so beyond all of us that he didn't even know the department chair who was his boss. And we had a supper one night and invited everybody over to our house, and we're eating supper, and he's watching the dude at the end of the table, and he says to me, Luis, who is that guy? I said, Mr. Gaines, that's your boss. And he said, I don't like that guy. But when the book, he said two things in my hearing which moved me profoundly, and it made me love him even more. And one of them was, he was stopped by a reporter, and they wanted to know, you know, now that Oprah's picked your book, and it's become a great text, and he said it was a perfectly good book before Oprah read it. And another time someone stopped him, we were walking through the hall, and they said, how does it feel to be America's greatest black writer? And he looked at him and he said, have you ever asked Michael Jordan how it feels to be the greatest black basketball player? He said, my intention was to be the greatest writer. That really moved me, really moved me. So, you know, he was an inspiration, and he was a lot of fun, a really great man. And, you know, to have him on the corner, you'd see our kids, they were little kids going to Mr. Gaines's house and hassling him. I was like, you don't hassle Mr. Gaines. Or going to trick-or-treat, trick-or-treat, Mr. Gaines! He'd be like, okay, well, get some candy for you, you know? And he's such a gentleman. He does things that are so exquisite and touching, and then I'll move on from it. But when we got settled there, when he came back from France, he hosted a dinner party for us at his house. It was no hoopla or anything. I had a couple of books in those days, and he had set up a little display of my books on a table by the front door. No big deal, but they were set up on stands. I thought, what? How fine is that? So we love him a lot. Yes? Observations about Panama.
Well, I haven't been back in about 2 years, which is the longest that I haven't been there. I had a baby a few months ago, so that's part of the reason. But we're planning to go back, I think, in probably the next spring. I mean, it's changed a lot lately. Ever since the canal shifted hands from the Americans to the Panamanians, things have really changed. Because the Panamanians have realized that this could be really a tourist attraction. And they've taken a lot of steps to try to build in some infrastructure, like make the airport a little bit nicer, build some museums. I mean, it used to be, I mean, my parents would take us to the canal every time we would go, you know, and we would kick and scream, we don't want to go, this is so boring, you know, and I thought, you know, it was no big deal. I thought, you know, isn't everybody doing this on their summer vacation, going to the Panama Canal? But we would go and there were just bleachers, just a set of bleachers, and you would just drive in and sit and,
oh, really?
You know, you would wait for the ships to go through and then we would drive home again. And now they have it all sort of built up. There's a museum, there's a restaurant, which is really cool. You can sit, it like has a balcony that juts out almost over the locks. So you can sit out on it and feel like you can almost reach out and touch the ships as they're going through, which is kind of cool. But they're doing a lot of things like that lately, I think, to try, you know, to make it more of a destination sort of place. I think they always sort of feel eclipsed by the shadow of a place like Costa Rica, you know, where people tend to go more for honeymoons and all that kind of stuff, and they want to be that place. I mean, there's a new museum there. There's just a whole bunch of stuff, and they're building a whole new subway system, which they never had before. They had these buses, which was one of my favorite things as a kid, is they were called the Diablos Rojos, and they were these buses that were like, I mean, they almost ran as taxis in the sense that they were like independently owned, each bus. So the person who owned the bus, the driver, would paint their bus in the most elaborate way possible to attract people to their bus. So, you know, there would be these city buses running through that had, you know, like horns coming out of them and, you know, were just painted in these kind of crazy ways. And we all loved those as kids, and now those are sort of gone. Because they're trying to build in, you know, like an actual official subway system and all that kind of stuff. So some of the charm is being lost, I think. And as a kid, we would go and stay with my grandparents, and they rented their house and rented it their whole lives. And then when we would come, they would rent beds to have extra spaces for us to sleep and stuff like that. And when my grandfather died, my grandmother couldn't keep the house anymore, so she moved in with my aunt. And they tore that house down. And so now when I go, you know, that's one of the places we always go, and we go and look at just the empty, overgrown lot where my grandparents' house used to be. So those are the things that, like, I see when I go to Panama. Again, they're not like, you know, I read, people will forward me every once in a while, like, there's an article in the New York Times about traveling to Panama and all these great things to do in Panama. I know none of them, you know, like I read the article and I'm like, oh, that sounds great, but I've never been to any of those places. I don't know anything. And when people are going and they ask me, you know, where should I go? Where should I eat? What should I do? I'm, you know, no idea. Because, you know, we were just, again, doing sort of all the day-to-day kind of things. But, you know, there's an area along the bay there that's so pretty with all the buildings, and you can drive along Avenida Balboa, and, you know, my mom would tell us she and my dad used to go and, like, park there on the rocks and, like, hang out and do whatever they were doing. But, I mean, you know, it's bigger, I think, than Panama City is bigger than people think it might be. I mean, the first time we took my husband there, and he's from Hinsdale, I think he was sort of surprised, didn't understand or didn't expect that it was going to be quite as cosmopolitan and huge and glittering as it is. But, I mean, the country overall is very small, and about 80% of the population lives in Panama City. So it's pretty congested, and, you couldn't pay me enough money to drive there because, there's no rules, and people don't stop at the stop signs. You just come up to a stop sign and beep twice and then keep going and, hope that someone heard you because you're coming through. But, to me, it's a magical place. Yeah. I'll let you call on people.
How are you?
It was very fascinating. It was very fascinating how you said that a portion of your life, both of you talked about this, a portion of your life or a place needs to marinate in you before it starts to bubble up and come out. So I was just wondering, does it stay once it has come out, or does it recede at some point and you feel that experience has or that place has expressed itself and there is no more there?
Oh, gosh.
I always worry that it's going to recede and that I will somehow exhaust that place. So far, that hasn't happened. And I think, for me, you just keep going back to the place to find more, to sort of dredge more out of it. I'm always worried about it, but so far that hasn't happened to me. I don't know if you have a different experience.
No, I feel like a tie-dye shirt. Just keep adding little rings of psychedelic color. But, I think that as those things happen, you expand. You become, I don't know if any of you are Doctor Who fans, but we're like the TARDIS, where he says it's bigger on the inside. I think you get bigger on the inside as time goes on, and things that come up for you, for me anyway, are usually a celebration.
I think it is generative in the sense of and I think that about any kind of creation in general, which is that you shouldn't hold back anything. You should always put everything you can into the project and then have faith that there'll be more there for the next project. And that not only will there be more there, but that because you put it all into this one, it's generating more for the next project.
I think so, absolutely. Yeah.
So I think, if you think maybe you've used it all up, I've tapped into every memory I ever had about Panama, but it's not true. You funnel down further once you use that one memory, I think.
Your
I'll
turn.
let you call.
No, your turn.
I don't know. Go ahead.
Thanks. This question kind of goes to the theme of the festival, America. We're a nation of immigrants, and there's been literature from Italian Americans, from Black Americans, from Greek Americans, from Jewish Americans. What's inherently the same and what's inherently different of Latino American literature from those others?
No, I thought Cristina could answer that. It's a really odd bit of mental gymnastics one has to do, because certainly in the Mexican-American experience, they consider themselves indigenous. And, as one guy said to me in Texas, if I crossed a river and I'm called a wetback, what did you guys who came across an ocean, what are you? Wet fronts? And there's the experience, of a lot of the Mexican people anyway, in this country of the Treaty of Guadalupe Hidalgo, waking up one morning and Santana had sold northern Mexico to the United States. They were suddenly aliens. They thought, what the hell just happened? That's a very odd issue, but it's very complex for me, because look at me. I'm the Bubba-looking Mexican. And You know, my grandmother was named Guadalupe Murray, and my uncle was named Carlos Hubbard. So, you know, Mexico was truly a melting pot like the United States. My people came to the New World as conquistadores. We were actually Basque. Urrea means man of gold. Bubba looking man. And they came to Chile first and headed north. So I find myself in a really odd position in that the mestizaje within my Mexican family, the actual, you know, marrying with indigenous people, which was very true in my family. I have Apache relatives, Yaqui relatives, Mayo relatives, the real deal, real Americans. And then us, the original illegal immigrants, came over from Spain and invaded somebody else's land. It's a very complex issue for me. I think there's a universal element in this. I think that what gets lost sometimes with the, quote, illegal immigration issue is that, you know, at base, a lot of it is a love, believe it or not, for the United States, a love for the freedom and the opportunity. I can swear to you right now, I'm probably the only writer at UIC who got his writing career started in the Tijuana municipal garbage dump. I'm willing to bet you 20 bucks. You know, I always call this, I'm on the road every month of my life, sometimes every week. And I call it the God Bless America tour. Because you do not come out of a dirt street in Tijuana with tuberculosis and do this for a living. It's not possible. Oh yeah, by the way, it's possible in the United States, maybe. So, you know, those issues are at play all the time for me. I don't know about the Panamanian experience, but, you know, Hummingbird's daughter, the trajectory of that really helped me understand even more profoundly that, you know, my mother's people were English and they came, you know, married with Hungarians who came. And then my father's people with our experience. In Queen of America, she goes to New York City and settles on East 28th Street at the turn of the century, and she's with all of the immigrants, but she's aware that she's coming in the wrong direction. She comes in the back way, whereas everybody's coming in from Europe. But I realized, wow, this is sort of my, you know, it's my Henry Roth novel, or my, you know, it's my Il Doctoro novel with Mexicans. And I think there's a very tight bond there. And, you know, people, in my experience, coming and working really hard and, yes, trying to reap the benefits of the American dream. But also, I think everybody I've known, except the miscreants in the family, have been trying to also pitch into the American dream. And what seems to get lost, I think, in a lot of the debate is that, you know, a lot of that population that came here was actually really rather conservative politically. And the conservative politics in America scared them. But, you know, you think about it, it's very family-oriented, very church-oriented. You know, they're not into all kinds of crazy liberal ideas, like I am. I don't know. What's your experience of that, the immigrant vibe?
I don't know. It's something I've been thinking about a lot lately with this new book that I've been working on, which is about a group of immigrants who all live in one apartment building in Delaware. And then people say to me, well, are there immigrants in Delaware? You know, like, why Delaware? Shouldn't you be writing about Arizona or California or, you know, Texas? But there's actually like a huge immigrant population, as there is everywhere, and
yeah.
People don't realize it necessarily. And the reason there partly is because there's these mushroom farms in Pennsylvania where people are coming to work and then they're living right across the state line in Delaware. It's really complicated. I'm trying to get my thoughts together on it before I have to go out and promote this book in a year or whatever, right?
People will be asking.
So I was taking mental notes while you were talking. But I mean, it's too big. I can't even.
But, you know, it's also, what is interesting to me is that you know, when you realize the fabric of what's happened in the country, if you can contextualize it in that fabric, it becomes a much more beautiful story than the propaganda story you hear.
Right. Well, the reason I wrote this book was because, I mean, my mom and I were talking. She works as a translator for the school district. And so she works with all these immigrant families. And we were just talking about this issue generally and the way that it gets portrayed in the media. And she said to me, you know, no one ever calls Pop and asks him his story. No one from the newspaper. You know, they don't care. No one wants to talk about somebody who came here, who contributed to this society,
Right.
who worked his way up and is, by all accounts, successful, has had 3 kids who have gone on to do successful things. No one wants to hear that story, you know? And that's really a shame, because not hearing that story is what's, you know, that's the division. That's what's keeping us apart. Not understanding that there are people who have come here and who are doing all,
Doing the thing.
the right thing.
Yeah, I agree.
So that was my impetus for writing this new book, and it has a collection of all these voices of characters who are similar to that. You know, the side that you don't hear of, you know, there's a character in there who's, you know, talks about how if you listen to the media, you know, you think everybody is, you know, carrying machine guns and is, you know, throwing bodies in vats of acid, and it's just like, you know, it's
Like my
so
cousins.
over the top and so divisive.
It is over the top.
Yeah, but there's a real, you know, other side of the story that no one's really.
And you know, it's
Talk
funny,
about
there are places too, I know we're running out of time, but there are places here in the Midwest, I think, where the paradigm has shifted and is being rethought, and there's so much possibility. You know, one of my books out there is basically a celebration of Kankakee, or as interviewers outside of Illinois like to call it, Kankakee. What's your fascination with Kankakee? But you know, if you look up what Mayor Green did in Kankakee, it's really beautiful. Or Kalamazoo has got, you know, there are places that are figuring this thing out, independent of all the struggles and issues in America, the larger. And I think that is so beautiful, that people dealing with people to meet a mutual problem and best it together is what I think it's
And I
about.
think it's an honor as a writer to be able to bring that to the fore.
Yeah,
You know,
absolutely.
to tell those stories.
But about all of us. You know, I try to end every talk, and I said it in Tucson yesterday, I firmly believe there is no them, there is only us. And we keep forgetting. We are all on this same little rock, man. And you know, if we could get rid of them thinking, we'd be much better off.
Well, I remember right before my first book came out, I was fortunate to have gotten to know Sandra Cisneros a little bit, and we were sitting in a cafe and talking, and she said to me, when you go out there, don't let them tell you that you're a Latino writer. Tell them you're an American writer, you know? And that was something that has stuck with me for a long time, so.
That's awesome.
And on that note, I think we are going to have to wrap it up. Thank you very much. As I believe Susan mentioned, we do have a book signing right by the door. Thank you.